I think the Army intelligence angle is very important to the JFK assassination. So I'm going to talk about another officer in Army intelligence, Colonel Robert E. Jones. He was stationed at the headquarters on the day of the assassination, not in Dallas. I think it was San Antonio. And he testified before the HSCA in 1978. Apparently, he was not available to the ARRB in the 1990s because even though they talk about him, they don't have an interview with him. They refer to his HSCA testimony. And I feel like listening to my own voice here, so I'm going to read this part of the draft report from the military intelligence team of the ARRB. Colonel Robert E. Jones's HSCA testimony. Colonel Robert E. Jones appeared before the HSCA on April 20, 1978, and in sworn testimony told the panel that he had been operations officer for the 112th INTC Group at the time of the assassination. He also said the group had been involved in presidential security activities on November 22, 1963, and that it had had between 8 and 12 plainclothes agents in Dealey Plaza, a remarkable assertion in light of the fact that no such military presence had previously been noted by the Secret Service, the FBI, or the Warren Commission. Jones so impressed the committee with his bearing and demeanor that Representative Dodd gushed at the close of his testimony that you have been an extremely responsive witness, extremely helpful. I wish that all of our witnesses we had were just as competent, concise, detailed, and as willing as you have been. The committee's final report found Jones's testimony to be credible. Unfortunately, on closer examination, Jones appears to have been something less than a credible witness. His testimony contains many patent inaccuracies and misrepresentations, beginning with what his job in the 112th actually was. Jones testified that he had been operations officer for the 112th MI Group and served as operations officer from June 1963 until January 1, 1965. However, the 112th unit history for the 1962 to 63 says that then Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Jones became the Group 2 intelligence officer in August 1963, and that the Group S3 operations officer at the time of the assassination was actually Lieutenant Colonel Stanley Greer. We confirmed this by examining Jones's and Greer's official military records at the Military Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. According to his personal record, Jones never served as 112th INTC Group's operations officer, though he did move up to become the group executive officer in 1964. So here he's apparently lying about his job description in the Army, which I think Army personnel are usually pretty well aware of what their job was or their rank. This isn't rank, this is a job, but this has to be a lie. There's no way he would misremember this. And he can't be incompetent, I would think, because he became the group's executive officer in 1964. So it must be a lie. It's not just that he's insane. Continuing with the document, it appears that Jones's misrepresentation of his duties with the 112th was not an isolated slip of the tongue, since at other points during his testimony he remarked that upon my assignment to the 112th, I was appointed the operations officer for the entire group, and that I directed operations for the 7 regions. Now, even though he's working at the headquarters in San Antonio, this means he would be directing operations for the Dallas office. Nor was this an inadvertent failure of memory. 2 weeks before his sworn testimony, Jones told HSCA staffer Harold Leap during a preparatory interview that he had actually been the 112th INTC Group's chief of intelligence, not its operations officer. So he's given 2 different stories to the HSCA, apparently, though the main story being that he was the operations officer. Whether Jones was the operations officer, S3, or intelligence officer, S2, is significant because it bears directly on the extent to which Jones knew what he was talking about. The S3 would have been the person responsible for overseeing the 112th's plans, operations, and training, and will be much more knowledgeable of the 112th's day-to-day activities than the S2. Most importantly, the S3 would be the person at the 112th at San Antonio's headquarters most likely to have any knowledge, for example, of whether members of the Dallas Regional Office had been asked to assist the Secret Service with presidential security. On the other hand, the principal function of the Group S2 was to read and file the intelligence reports, background investigations, and other materials submitted by the regional offices, and to prepare summary reports for higher headquarters. In that capacity, which appears to have been his actual position, Jones might not have had much real knowledge about what went on in Dallas, aside from whatever he might have gleaned from such reports rendered after the fact. And I think I'll read the footnote here. As a retired Army officer, and this is the writer of the document saying, I can say from personal experience that it is axiomatic that the S3 is ordinarily the best informed officer in any unit about what that unit is doing, commonly knowing more about day-to-day nuts and bolts than even the unit commander himself. The S2, on the other hand, is often almost laughably clueless about what's going on, as his duties have less connection to current operations than almost anyone else in the unit. A typical anecdote is the one about the S2 who dashes out of his office on VJ Day to breathlessly tell his commander that, after years of careful analysis and study, he has positively confirmed that it was the Japanese who bombed Pearl Harbor. So this footnote emphasizes how clueless the S2 would be, and Jones apparently was really the S2 and not the S3. A careful reading of Jones's HSCA testimony reveals that, in fact, throughout, he attributed his recollections almost entirely to written reports rather than first-hand knowledge, a vantage more consistent with the duties of the unit's intelligence officer. So that's some pretty insightful analysis there, which is kind of weird coming from a government investigation or whatever of the assassination of JFK. Usually they're not so attentive to things. Continuing with the document, it would appear then that Colonel Jones may have consciously misstated his duty position in his sworn testimony to the HSCA. Like I said, he lied. Whether he misled the HSCA in order to inflate his credentials and importance, or whether there was some other more benign reason, cannot be known. I think it's worth noting here that the author is once again reverting to the typical government investigator interpretation of stating what is probably a very benign motivation as being the worst possible motivation. That is, they're saying it's worse if he's lying just to make himself look good than it might some other possible reason. Implication being there couldn't be any more or less benign reason, like he might be involved in a conspiracy to murder JFK. That's not even on the table in this person's mind. For our purposes, however, the significance of this misrepresentation is that it not only undermines Jones's stature as a competent, concise, and credible witness, but it strongly suggests that some or all of his authoritative-sounding pronouncements to the committee, and especially those where he asserts no first-hand knowledge, may have been little more than the imaginative guesswork of a self-important blowhard. At the very least, one should approach Jones's overall testimony with a healthy amount of skepticism. And once again, I'll go to the footnote. This perception is strengthened by other patent mistakes or falsehoods in his testimony. For example, Jones asserted that James W. Powell was an officer, a captain, and he was actually a sergeant, on duty in Dealey Plaza at the time of the assassination. Powell was actually a sergeant, E5, a fact confirmed both by Powell himself and by our examination of Powell's VA and military records. According to Powell, he was not on duty at the time of the assassination, but rather had asked for the day off in order to see the presidential visit. Returning to the body of the document, with that in mind, it should be noted that Jones's remarkable assertion that there were between 8 and 12 plainclothes intelligence agents from the 112th INTC. Okay, that's as far as I'm going to read of that document. So this report apparently is more concerned with his statement that there were military intelligence officers in Dealey Plaza at the time of the assassination, when everybody else says there weren't. That's not what I'm concerned with here. That was from the draft report. This is from the final report. The final report is a much more condensed version of that draft report, but it says essentially the same thing. That is that Jones was lying about his job at the 112th, saying he was the operations officer when he was actually the security officer, and that the operations officer was actually Lieutenant Colonel Stanley W. Greer. And as those ARRB documents say, according to the 112th Group history, it was Lieutenant Colonel Stanley W. Greer who was appointed Group S3 during August 1963. That is, he held the operations office command, and Jones did not. Jones was probably the security officer, and he was lying about that. He was saying that he was doing the job that was actually done by Greer. And if, as I suspect, Operations Plan Number 1, which I referred to in my last video, if that was a plan to murder the president, then it would be Greer who was actually in charge of that operation rather than Jones. And this seems significant to me because it was another Greer, William Greer, the driver of the presidential limousine, who certainly did turn around and point something at JFK at the time that JFK was being shot in the head. That certainly is the case, despite what the shills and idiots will say. And whether Greer fired or not, you can't tell because the Zapruder film was altered to obscure. You can see, like in the upper left corner here, I have part of a frame from a Zapruder film, where the editor of the film has obscured whatever it is Greer is pointing back towards the president at the time that he's being shot. And in the next film, on the bottom right-hand corner, you can see that he apparently is holding a gun, or something shaped like a gun, something like a gun, after he has turned around after the president has been shot. So I think it's significant that the guy in charge of the operation to murder the president, as I say, has the same last name as the guy who actually did shoot the president, or one of the guys who actually did shoot the president. I think that's significant. We have two Greers here, even though I have not been able to prove that they are relations. I think it's significant they have the same last name. So apparently Lieutenant Colonel Jones was lying in order to hide the fact that it was Lieutenant Colonel Stanley W. Greer who was in charge of operations, and one of those operations included the murder of the president. That's what it looks like to me. And I find this FBI document interesting from December 5th, 1963. Down at the bottom there, somebody has put an asterisk next to this paragraph, and I think for good reason. I don't know who did that. I think I got this from the Malcolm Blunt archives. So maybe Malcolm Blunt recognized the importance of this. I don't know. Anyway, it says, and this is from the FBI, at the Army Intelligence Corps office, in the absence of Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Jones, interviewed Major James, I don't know if that's an R or B, Mullins, operations officer. So the whole thing going on here in this video is, who's the operations officer? Is it Jones? Is it Greer? I think it's Greer. That's what the Army documents say. And now they're saying this James B. Mullins is the operations officer, and that they were trying to talk to Jones, but he wasn't available. And this name, James Mullins, hasn't come up before. And if we look at the Army's own roster listing for this office, the headquarters office, as of December 31st, 1963, there's no Mullins on the list. So, I mean, it's possible he could have left after December 5th when the FBI report was written, and wasn't there on the 31st, but that seems unlikely to me. It seems like this Mullins is a made-up name. And going back to the unit history here, it says, number 8 there, Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Jones was appointed Group S2, the security officer, during August 1963. Vice Lieutenant Colonel Joseph R. Mellon, who was replaced on the retired list. It sounds like, though it's not explicit here, it sounds like what it's saying is that this Joseph R. Mellon retired and was replaced by Colonel Jones. And Mellon is not on the December 31st roster. You would expect he wouldn't be if he retired in the summer when Colonel Robert Jones replaced him. And yet it sounds like a similar name, Mullins, similar to Mellon, has been used by whoever talked to the FBI, probably on the telephone. And it could have been Colonel Robert E. Jones just using that name because it was a name that was valid at one point, but even though it wasn't then. Or it could have been that the FBI actually talked to Greer and he used the name Mullins. I don't know, but it looks like what's being done here is that whoever is the operations officer, and I think it's Greer, is trying to hide the fact that he's the operations officer. And we've gotten two different names now. We get this Mullins guy as the operations officer, supposedly, in December 1963. And we get Jones in 1978 claiming that he was the operations officer, when apparently the actual operations officer was Greer. And for some reason, they don't want us to know that.